Hello and welcome to the Compassion Curve for Educators. I'm Sarah Daniel, the Vice President of Educational Services for SaintA. The mission of SaintA is to facilitate equity, learning, healing, and wellness by restoring connections that help children and families thrive. SaintA is a human services organization that strives to address the impact of trauma, prevent adversity, and promote resilience. We are headquartered at 89th and Capitol Drive in Milwaukee. The learning objectives for this series are listed here. In this session, we will learn to understand the difference between positive, tolerable, and toxic stress. We will also begin to understand compassion fatigue and its impact. The third objective is to understand the stress response and its impact on the brain and body. And finally, we will cover some strategies to support your well-being. I'd like to begin this session with a brief grounding activity to get us focused. You will need a piece of paper and a pen. Feel free to pause this webinar if you need to go get those items. Now I want you to focus inward on your breath. Block out all distractions and bring your attention to just your immediate surroundings. Where are you sitting while you're watching this webinar? And I want you to look around your surroundings and on the piece of paper, write down 5 things that you see. What are the things that you see in your environment? Write them down. Now take a deep breath and write down 4 things that you can feel. Is it the chair you're sitting in, the pen you're holding, maybe even the surface of your table, your skin, your hair? And go ahead and touch those things and then write down the 4 things you can feel. Now take a deep breath and let's reflect on 3 things that you can hear right now. Are there cars driving by? Birds in the background? Write down those 3 things. Now take a deep breath and write down 2 things that you can smell right now. Maybe you're having your morning coffee or some other beverage. Write down 2 things you can smell. And finally, take a deep breath and write down 1 thing that you can taste right now. Thank you to those of you who engaged in that activity. I hope that gave us a little moment to just center in and focus on the here and now for even a brief period of time. The compassion curve is a concept that originated at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Many people were talking about flattening the curve of transmission. And at SaintA, we started talking about the need to accelerate our curve of compassion. So accelerate the ways in which we were compassionate towards each other and towards those that we were educating or serving in a mental health capacity. I'm hopeful today that you can see this content as a way of focusing on yourself and thinking about how we increase compassion for each other, for our colleagues, and for ourselves during this difficult time. When we start to think about stress that we've experienced or are currently experiencing, we can categorize it in 3 different ways. Stress can be positive. It can be something that causes a brief elevation in our heart rate, but helps us to rise to a challenge or to overcome an obstacle. Positive stress can result when good things are happening in our lives, We're planning a wedding or a move or a new job. We're excited or happy, but stress is still part of the experience. We can also experience tolerable stress. This is when something more negative or serious happens in our lives, but we're able to connect with others who provide a supportive relationship that buffers the effects of this stress. Examples could be a good friend supporting you through a loss of an important relationship, or a spouse or a partner helping you to deal with the death of a friend or family member. It's not that the events aren't bad, it's just that we are able to overcome them with support. Toxic stress is when the stress response activation is prolonged and there are no protective relationships to buffer its effect. Think about the experiences that you've had in your lifetime, particularly in the past several months. Has the stress you've experienced been positive, tolerable, or toxic? Feel free to pause the webinar to think more about this. Compassion fatigue can also occur for those of us in professions where we feel responsible for the well-being of others. Education is definitely one of those professions. Compassion fatigue can include emotional, physical, or spiritual distress that we may experience when caring for others who also may be experiencing significant emotional or physical suffering. This, combined with ongoing primary stressors in our lives, can make us feel physically and mentally tired, overwhelmed, and burdened. We might have difficulty concentrating or making decisions when we are in this state. You might also feel frustrated or short-tempered. Pause the webcast to consider if you're experiencing this right now. Given the state of the pandemic and other stressors in the world, it would be normal for many people to feel this way, especially those who care for or educate others. In the next few slides, we will discuss why this happens and provide some ideas about what can help. So how does the brain and body respond when under stress or threat? The brain is designed to mobilize systems of the body to aid in survival. If a threat is perceived to your body, it may respond by releasing stress hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline. Fight or flight can kick in. Your breathing and heartbeat may speed up, your muscles may tense, and blood may be pumped to your arms and legs to allow you to move more quickly to fight off or run away from a threat. However, if the danger is perceived to be overwhelming and inescapable, your body may respond with a freeze response. Your heart rate and breathing may slow down to preserve resources, sending blood to your vital organs. You may experience feelings of detachment from the event, and your memory and awareness are dulled as you focus internally, not externally. When the stress response is activated, it becomes the primary focus of the brain. The higher thinking parts of the brain, in charge of logical thinking and planning, become less engaged as the lower systems of the brain that are in charge of survival take over. Pause the webinar to think a little bit about how your brain and body responds to stress and threat. Take a look at this list and consider what you have seen in your friends, family members, coworkers, and in yourself. Have you seen the inability to empathize or put yourself in another's shoes? Have you found yourself easily overwhelmed or unable to solve problems in your life? Do you find yourself numbing out by binge watching TV, playing games on your phone, or drinking alcohol? These are more dissociative ways that our body copes with stress, in which we either freeze or are unable to act to make decisions, or engage in mental flight or checking out. Or perhaps you've seen a more hypervigilant response in which you fight or flee. You feel anger, rage, guilt, fear, and find yourself complaining and blaming. Please consider that each one of these are reactions to stress. This is not to say that this provides an excuse for bad behavior, but perhaps gives us a window into understanding our own behavior and the behavior of others, and an opportunity to give each other a little forgiveness, a little support. To learn more about this, please see the link below this webinar to watch an optional 20-minute video by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, the author of Trauma Stewardship, where she explains these responses to stress and secondary trauma. Co-regulation between caregivers and children is important for healthy development. When a child's stress response is developing in early life, it responds to the adult caregivers in their lives. If caregivers are able to maintain regulation, to attune to a child's needs and meet those needs with empathy and understanding, a child's stress response develops in a way that sets the template for future positive coping with stress. If adults are dysregulated, they are often unable to identify or meet a child's needs, and interactions often cause both adult and child more frustration and dysregulation. If this pattern is consistent, a child's stress response may develop in a way that does not provide them with what they need to cope with future challenges and may impede their ability to engage in learning and growth. Think about the interactions that you experience. Is there more co-regulation or co-dysregulation? Regulated adults equal regulated children. Therefore, adult regulation needs to be prioritized. One of the perspective shifts that we often challenge people to make when they are looking at trauma-sensitive schools, trauma-sensitive practice, is to think kids do well if they can. It's something that came from a book written by Ross Greene called Lost at School, and it means kids do well if they can versus if they want to or choose to. And that if a child is not doing well, it's most often due to an expression of an unsolved problem, a lack of a skill, or an unmet need. I would challenge you to think about that in this really challenging time, that actually educators do well if they can. And that if you are struggling, or a colleague is struggling, or even an administrator is struggling, step back and think that they're doing well if they can. And if they're not doing well, or if you're not doing well, you're not doing your best right now, what are your unsolved problems, your lagging skills, or your unmet needs? And perhaps that perspective will help to open up some ideas about new solutions, new ways of solving problems, meeting needs, or learning skills. This is not to say that we are lowering expectations. We all have a job to do, and that job is really challenging right now. But this continuum was adapted here, this grid was adapted from restorative practice, in which we are looking at striving to get to a place where we have high compassion and support, again, for ourselves, for each other, but also high expectations and accountability. And only when both of those things are happening are we going to have successfully engaged staff, regulated staff, who are able to in turn provide that co-regulation that we talked about earlier to students and engage in that optimal learning. When you think about the ways in which you've been coping with stress and increased demands over the past several months, you might also be thinking that your traditional self-care strategies maybe are falling short after putting in really long hours or learning a completely new way of teaching. You're taking a walk, taking a deep breath. Those kinds of strategies don't seem to measure up to the challenges that you're facing. I would ask you to consider the way in which we at SaintA think about caregiver capacity and self-care as multi-tiered, the same way we think about intervention for students. And that even in the best of times, we have caregiver capacity strategies that are at tier 1 or at the universal level, things that are good for all folks to do. And then we might have folks that need additional support, small group debriefing, maybe an individualized self-care plan, really targeted culture and climate shifts in our schools. And then that might support a number of other educators to do their best. And occasionally we might have folks that need tier 3 support, maybe need one-on-one coaching, maybe need a little bit of mentoring, maybe need mental health therapy or consultation, maybe engage in the employee assistance program. That definitely is an option for folks. And what I want to challenge you to think about right now is that perhaps what used to be a tier 2 approach needs to be considered tier 1, that really the needs have increased so greatly that perhaps we need to consider more group debriefing, more individualized and targeted self-care plans, and more targeted culture and climate work. And other traditionally sort of tier 2 interventions have become the need on the universal level. And it's not to say that all stress is bad. That stress that is predictable, moderate, and that we can control will actually build resilience. But stress that's unpredictable, severe, prolonged, makes us more vulnerable to future stressors as well. I really believe that if we can create stressors in a way that is predictable and moderate, we will actually come out of this time looking back and thinking about the enormous amounts of things we've learned, the innovations that we've accomplished. So I want you to think about the stressors in your life and ways in which you can make them more predictable, more moderate, more controlled. For example, if you are consuming news media, social media on an ongoing basis, and it's making you upset or stressed, limit yourself to a window of time. I'll check the news once a day, twice a day, so that you can predict when that stress is going to occur. You can moderate it, you can respond to it, and prepare in a way that you can feel a sense of mastery and control. And that will actually create more resilience for you. I encourage you to pause this recording to think a little bit about that. Think about the stressors in your life and what are the things that are within your control and what are the things that aren't. And maybe there's some things that aren't in your control that we need to sort of let go. But if there are stressors in our life that are within our control, how do we become more intentional about creating that predictable, moderate, and controlled response? If you are experiencing any of the things discussed in these slides, please don't hesitate to reach out for support. Seek out positive relationships in your life. Find yourself someone in your life that empathizes with you, but is also able to move you towards problem solving and not just simply engaging in venting sessions where both participants feel worse. Engage in virtual community, groups, or a virtual congregation. Have dinner with a friend virtually in which you cook and eat the same foods over a virtual platform. Make a commitment to prioritize relationship and connection. And finally, seek out counseling services or an employee assistance program to talk to someone trained to provide help with problem solving and guidance on how to deal with whatever challenges you may be facing right now. Make a commitment to use strategies that will increase your brain's ability to regulate. Regulation has, in these times, become an ethical obligation of our profession, in that we need to engage in regulation so that co-regulation is possible. Take a look at this list and see what you can commit to, what you can put on your calendar to really prioritize your own time for regulation. Many mental health providers have both in-person and online sessions available. Many insurance companies have temporarily waived deductibles for telehealth services. There are many resources in the community. SaintA's link for services is shown on the bottom of this slide. Our therapists specialize in supporting educators and helpers. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this webinar, and thank you so much for all that you do to educate and support the children in our community.